In the birth of desire, the third person is always present. Arguably, almost the entirety of a person's life is structured around the concept of desire. What we desire shapes so many of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviours that to not address it leaves much of the human condition completely unexamined. There are few issues as essential to making sense of ourselves and the world as understanding where human desire comes from and what makes some of our desires so intense that they drive people to violence and conflict. This is where Rene Girard comes in. Over the course of the late 20th century, he put forward one of the most influential theories of desire in history. If it is correct, it has enormous implications for philosophy, psychology, sociology, politics, and more. So today, I want to look at the basic framework behind his theories, found in his very first book, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel. Get ready to learn how your desires are not purely your own, why rivalry is vital to our understanding of politics, and perhaps the most important piece of self-knowledge you will ever discover. As always, bear in mind I will only be able to cover a fraction of the content of Girard's book in this video, and I highly encourage you to read it for yourself to get your own reflections. Girard is also a very complicated thinker, so I will be simplifying some of his concepts for this video, so I beg your patience with that. But with that out of the way, let's begin by exploring the foundation of Girard's thesis in this book. The concept of mimetic desire. 1. Mimetic desire, a brief overview. There is a huge assumption which burns at the heart of our self-perception. Dostoevsky once said that there are some truths that are so hard to bear that we will not admit them to anyone, not even ourselves. According to Girard, this is one of those truths. That many of our desires are not purely our own, but are in fact caught from other people. And in some situations, our desire is actually to be another person. In our everyday lives, we often take it completely for granted that our desires stem in some sense from us. Even the greatest philosophers in history have rarely stopped to question this. For instance, while Schopenhauer, the Stoics, and the Buddha all talked about the pain that unfulfilled desire can bring, it is often tacitly assumed that our desires still ultimately arise from within us. This is reflected in our first-person experience, after all. If I were to uncritically think about what happens when I want, say, a new jumper, it goes something like this. I see the jumper, I think, that looks nice, and then I get a desire to obtain the jumper. And most of our wants feel very much like this. We think we fall in love with someone purely because of the qualities of the person we love. We think we want our dream job, car, or house because those things have attractive properties. Everything from our food preferences to our life plans often is thought to come from something deep within. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche called it the will, while the Stoics called it the passions or sometimes the appetite, depending on the thinker. But either way, it is almost always tacitly assumed to simply be part of us and part of our minds. But it is this foundational premise of our everyday life that Rene Girard calls into question. At its core, mimetic desire is a very simple concept. A mimetic desire is a desire that we catch off another person, be they real and present, or a personified ideal like a book character, a legendary figure, or a spiritual leader. We tend to recognize this phenomenon if it appears at a very trivial level. For instance, it is evident in the purchasing trends that appear in a society and then disappear just as quickly, especially in something like fashion. In the UK, there was, for a while, a trend of men wearing absurdly skinny jeans, almost to the point of infertility. On a surface level, the individuals involved probably thought they looked really good, and by the fashion standards of the time, I suppose they did. However, this is clearly not the whole story. People wanted to wear them and came to regard them as fashionable because other people were wearing them. It was a desire spawned by the opinions and tendencies of others. And history tells us this can happen with some totally arbitrary things. From the brief Victorian fad of making hats out of taxidermied birds to the tulip mania of 17th century Holland, which culminated in a speculative bubble, the force of mimetic desire occasionally becomes painfully obvious. However, for Girard, mimetic desire is certainly not limited to these sort of frivolities, but can become deadly serious. In some ways, he thought this would be inevitable. Imitation is a key skill we humans use to learn and survive. As many psychologists like Albert Banderu have pointed out, young children learn all sorts of things not by being told them, but instead by copying the adults around them and then refining that process until they get it right. In Girard's terminology, the person we are imitating in our desire is called the mediator. We can think of the object of the desire, the desirer, and the mediator as sort of forming a triangle. The mediator desires the object, and then the desirer desires the object because of the mediator. As I said, it's quite a simple concept. The real nuance comes in the different types of mimesis Girard outlines, and, more importantly, their differing effects. First, we can place different mediators along a scale regarding what Girard calls their spiritual distance from the desirer. This sounds like it will be quite woolly, but it actually ends up being a very down-to-earth concept. A mediator is more towards the external end of the spectrum if they cannot be a rival for the desired object, and they are more towards the internal end if they can be a rival for the desired object. A good example is the difference between imitating a spiritual ideal and a real physical person that you know. If my desire is mediated through this external person, someone like Christ or the Buddha, in order to attain some kind of spiritual fulfillment or set of moral values, those mediators cannot compete with me for that goal. If nothing else, they're just not physically there to do so. By contrast, if my mediator is my neighbor and I desire to be extremely wealthy because he does, or even extremely spiritually fulfilled because he does, then he is much more likely to become a rival to me. We will be rivals to see who can become more wealthy than the other or more spiritually fulfilled than the other, and this will probably cause some conflict, either emotional conflict or, in extreme cases, maybe even physical violence. Secondly, Girard draws the distinction between more mundane mimetic desires and what he calls metaphysical mimetic desires. Whereas more standard cases of mimetic desire involve desiring the same object as our mediator, metaphysical desire is the wish to in some way become our mediator, to want their life, their existence, and ultimately to be them. In mild forms, this could be desiring their social status or their fame, but in more serious ones, it could be desiring their very identity. Girard sometimes calls this state of wishing to be someone other than ourselves ontological sickness. We can imagine the process a bit like this. For whatever reason, we admire someone, and that admiration takes on a certain transcendence to the point where we implicitly see them as someone to imitate, and not just imitate in their desires, but imitate in their being. Just like how Christians want to emulate Christ, we wish to emulate whatever this person does. It's one reason why Girard sometimes sees metaphysical desire as a form of worship and often then couches it in very religious terms. For him, it is someone else assuming the role that religious figures, or God himself, normally take. And, as will become a running theme of this video, these patterns are relatively easy to spot in other people, but considerably harder to own up to ourselves. This is because, in our current value system, we find the idea that we could desire something because of someone else, or even desire to be someone else, intensely embarrassing. This is what Girard calls the romantic set of values. Think of our popular culture and how often it glorifies the single person standing alone against others, pursuing their self-sourced passion wherever it leads. There are not many romance films or adventure stories where the protagonist spends the entire time merely imitating other people. As a result, Girard thinks we conceal our mimetic desires even from ourselves, to spare our egos the realization that what we want is as much shaped by other people as it is by us. But there is danger in this path, because if we are unaware of our imitation, then it can easily turn destructive. And I would like to explore some of those paths now. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of my wonderful patrons on Patreon to gain access to very occasional exclusive content. The link is in the description. Oh, I almost forgot. I also have a Substack now where I post the scripts to these videos, so you can sign up to that as well if you like. 2. Double mediation and conflict. In Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, a large part of the initial story follows Dmitry Karamazov and his father Fyodor as they fight over the shared object of their romantic passions, a young woman named Grushenka. As a result, they fall into a bitter rivalry that ultimately kicks off the plot of the book. Dmitri sees his father as a lecherous old man attempting to rob him of his happiness, while Fyodor sees Dmitri as some upstart little whelp who should show a bit more respect to his father, however inadequate a father that might have been. I won't spoil where this rivalry leads, but suffice to say, it does not end well. And this sort of dynamic is exactly the kind of thing Girard is worried about with his idea of double mediation. Double mediation is sort of a strange concept, but once you see it, you just can't unsee it. It occurs when two people serve as one another's mediators. That is, they each want what the other wants because the other wants it. We often see this dynamic most openly with young children and, anecdotally, especially siblings. I am lucky enough to have a number of younger siblings, and I remember that when my sister and brother were little, they used to fight over toys or games or clothes that just did not matter to them in the slightest, except that the other person wanted it at that moment in time. My sister would show a sudden interest in my brother's scarf as soon as he put it on, or my brother would immediately be fascinated by my sister's book the moment she started to read it, and this put them instantly into conflict. And I think many of you would have seen similar things in your own life. The trouble is, as soon as two people enter double mediation, their effective aim becomes to take everything they possibly can from the other person because that other person desires it. We see this dynamic at play in more minor ways in romantic rivalries. One of the things that is thought to make someone desirable to others is social proof, that is, already being desired by many people. But this immediately leads to a form of double mediation between every one of the romantic rivals. Thus, there is a huge propensity for enmity and conflict here. Girard is not necessarily saying this is a bad thing in all situations, but rather simply describing an effect that shared mediation can have. Of course, double mediation can only really occur when two people are spiritually close in the way that we defined it in the last section. That is, that they even can compete for the same desire. This is one reason why, on average, Girard thinks that external mediation, where the mediator is distant, often causes less conflict because the rivalry simply cannot develop. It's worth noting that Girard's observation here does not simply apply at the individual level. He says it is entirely possible for groups of people to find mediators in other groups, and for this to sometimes lead to double mediation as well. So, in an aristocratic court, every group might have the group above them as their mediators, the gentry imitating the higher aristocracy and the aristocracy imitating the inner circle of the monarch, and so on. But Girard says that one consequence of democracy that we ought to watch out for is that since we are all, in theory, equal, this sort of double mediation can start to occur more often. To clarify, Girard is not saying that this makes democracy bad, just that, like all governmental systems, it has effects that we might want to keep an eye on. He uses the example of the sort of bourgeois competitiveness found in Proust novels, as well as his own observations about middle-class culture. He points out that this setting is almost tailor-made to birth a sort of misery-creating double mediation. My American friend tells me there is even a phrase for this in the US, keeping up with the Joneses. People decide that they must have something because their neighbour has it, and their neighbour responds by getting something that they have. For Girard, comparison is the thief of joy is an incomplete observation. It should be, comparison is the thief of joy when we contract mimetic desires from that comparison and so enter double mediation, though admittedly, that is more of a mouthful. Girard argues that this shared mediation is crucial for understanding why and when conflicts arise within a society. If we sometimes desire things simply because other people have or want them and vice versa, then any purely material analysis of social competition becomes incomplete. Importantly, Girard is not saying that material circumstances like inequality do not breed conflict and resentment. He is rather saying that we should be careful not to attribute all conflict and resentment to factors like these. For Girard, it is perfectly possible for people to enter into bitter rivalries over things that have virtually no significance in and of themselves. Indeed, the less value the object of desire has apart from the mimesis, the purer the symbolic victory over the rival. Having an expensive ornament on your shelf may be pointless, apart from the fact that the next time another well-to-do family visits you, they will notice it and envy you. Girard says this is all closely related to a sort of psychological power that is held by the mediator over the mediated. We can think of double mediation not so much as a static state, but rather an ever-changing process where at points one party becomes the more dominant mediator, and then it might switch back, and so on. For whoever's in that dominant mediating spot, they then hold a form of influence over the other person. They inspire envy, a sort of reluctant admiration, and most importantly, they agitate the other person's mind. Again, perhaps this is most clear with a romantic example. Girard points out that sometimes couples remain stuck in a dynamic where they are constantly switching places. As soon as one of them makes their desire known through overt affection, the other pulls away. But then the first person responds with coldness, which then draws the second person back in, and so on. Here, there is a clear power dynamic at play. Both of the lovers value one another as mediators. They feel good being the object of the other person's desire, or, to put it another way, they desire themselves through their lover's eyes. But whoever is in that dominant spot gets almost all of the decision-making power. They choose whether the entanglement ends, continues, and then on what terms it continues. Thus, the lovers are stuck vying for this position, and so they trap themselves in a cycle of behaviour that will just make them both miserable in the end. And again, it is all well and good observing this in other people, but Girard wants us to notice it in ourselves. So it's worth taking stock. Where do we think we've entered into this sort of double mediation in the past? If it helps, I will start. I have definitely been in romantic relationships which have almost exactly mirrored Girard's observations. It's actually something that I've worked hard to not fall into again, and I think I'll be much happier for it. Girard's is not a philosophy of mere contemplation, but of brutal, uncompromising practice. But if he is right, we will all be much happier recognizing where these sorts of dynamics arise in our lives, so we can make very careful decisions about what to do with them. But next, I want to move on to some of the more existential aspects of Girard's work. So let's revisit this concept of metaphysical desire and the wish to abandon your own self to become the mediator. 3. The depths of metaphysical desire. In some ways, we are likely to already be familiar with the sort of mimetic desire we've already looked at, especially in other people. As we said earlier, we see it in consumer choices and the notion of fads. The idea of a rivalry is also pretty commonplace, although we may not have analysed them in quite the way Girard did. But perhaps the most interesting extension of Girard's notion of mimetic desire is metaphysical desire. That is, the desire not just for what someone else has or what they want, but the desire to actually be someone else. For Girard, this sort of metaphysical desire is closely related to a sense of dissatisfaction or emptiness in our own lives. This is what he again calls ontological sickness. A person realizes that they feel disconnected with being themselves, and they see someone who represents some sort of ideal to them. They might be someone more successful or more desirable, or simply someone who does not seem to suffer from this feeling of ontological sickness. That person then slowly becomes their mediator. They implicitly see in them the solution to their existential woes. Again, this is a role Girard thought was previously played by religious figures. For Christians, imitating Christ was and is a way to avoid this ontological sickness. But in the absence of something like this, our metaphysical desire does not just go away, it finds new objects. For Girard, the trouble becomes pretty stark when we begin to take the real people around us as the mediators of our metaphysical desires. The desirer becomes stuck in a destructive state where they both resent this person they desire to be, but also deeply admire them. They see in them a release from all of their problems, but also notice just how inadequate they seem in comparison. They think that if only they were their mediator, they would finally be happy. But there are some real issues with this approach. The first is that attempting to become someone else is just an impossible task. This is why Girard thinks that the extreme end of metaphysical desire is technically death. Behind the wish to become someone else is ultimately the wish to escape yourself, and the only real way to do this is to die. The whole desire is a false promise, because even if the assumption that you would be happy being this other person is correct, it would still be totally impossible to do. Thus, in acquiring a strong metaphysical desire in this way, we set off on a never-ending journey, forever fooling ourselves into thinking that fulfillment is just around the corner. It's a similar observation to the one made by Arthur Schopenhauer about all our desires, but Girard thinks it is particularly pointed in this case. Secondly, the desire to be someone else only exacerbates the root cause of the issue, which is this feeling of ontological sickness and personal insufficiency. For Girard, the idea that our life in particular is uniquely empty and pointless is sort of a form of existential low self-esteem. But metaphysical desire essentially tells us that we are correct in this assessment, and that our intellectual woes are due to our inferiority when compared to our mediators. As a result, we take on a general stance of inadequacy about ourselves. So far from resolving our ontological sickness, this just ends up amplifying it. Thirdly, the dynamic that emerges between the desirer and the mediator in metaphysical desire can quickly turn incredibly ugly. For Girard, when we admire someone in this metaphysical way, we also tend to resent them and envy them. We are thus caught in a contradictory state. On the one hand, we want to get closer to our mediator, to win their attention and affection. But on the other, we resent them for being something we would want to be, and this makes us dislike them at some level because it threatens our pride. This is one reason Girard thinks metaphysical desire is closely aligned with hatred, and that may be behind the notion that there is a fine line between love and hate. We may have seen this situation ourselves. Someone admires someone else in a deep and profound way, but then feels rejected by that person, and so ultimately they leap to the other extreme. All their admiration immediately turns to hate and spite. We find this in Milton's Satan, or when some people in the real world face romantic rejection. If they fail to actually achieve their desire, they then turn to despising what they previously wanted to save themselves the indignity of admitting that they have failed. And in metaphysical desire, this trend reaches a fever pitch because the stakes just seem so much higher. What could have been a simple interpersonal relationship now feels like a matter of life and death because our very sense of self is now on the line. And it's not just Girard who has noticed this. It is a well-known trend among social psychologists that rejection from groups tends to spark self-destructive, resentful, and antisocial behaviour. Girard's theory simply partly explains why. Lastly, metaphysical desire is almost always untenably unstable when it is held for another real person. Girard thinks that however much we try to embody someone else, this will not grant us fulfillment because they are not us. They have different inner drives that are unlikely to match one-to-one with ours. Moreover, there is no guarantee that they are not suffering from exactly the same sort of ontological sickness we are. They may seem like they are existentially fulfilled all on their own, but secretly they may have their own metaphysical mediator and be trapped in their own cycle of resentment and admiration. So this is yet another way in which metaphysical desire can heighten the original ontological sickness. Disappointed with the results, the desirer abandons this particular mediator, but then the cycle begins anew. The ontological sickness propels us right back into metaphysical desire all over again. We think that while this mediator did not solve our ontological lack, some other mediator definitely would. When this new mediator inevitably does not help or brings disappointment, the ontological sickness worsens another step and the search for the fabled, perfect mediator continues. It's a sort of eternal tragedy where the only way is down. And, at the extreme end, Girard thinks that the metaphysical desirer ends up trapped in this vicious cycle until they almost lose hope. They fall into an existential void, grasping outwards for anyone who holds the briefest hope of giving them a scrap of fulfillment. To use Girard's own words, our mediators become a series of dictatorships as savage as they are temporary. For Girard, this is partly behind the existentialist philosopher's obsession with authenticity. But nonetheless, his solution to this destructive mimetic cycle is very different to someone like Heidegger or Sartre. Because, for Girard, authenticity comes from a surprising act of extreme humility. So, let's explore what Girard thinks we should all do about mimetic desire. 4. Humility and the self. As we said at the beginning of the video, it is incredibly difficult to admit to having mimetic desires because it strikes at the very core of our pride. This is even more pronounced in its more extreme versions. To admit that your own life feels so empty that you would happily trade in your identity with someone else is just not an easy thing to do. But, in Girard's view, it is this very thing that will help mitigate the destructive effects of some mimetic desires, and especially some metaphysical ones. On the surface, we can see how admitting to these desires might help to dispel or control them. As soon as you say something like, I think I only want this because other people do, or I think I want to become this person I admire, the absurdity of the situation becomes more apparent. At this point, what was a deep internal struggle becomes almost comic. As Nietzsche might say, we progress from a state of intense seriousness to one that feels far lighter. Seemingly, for Girard, it is partly this lightness that can bring us relief from the more destructive cycles of mediation. But this move is incredibly difficult to do if we have a large ego blocking our path, because it is essentially holding up our hands and saying, haven't I been silly? But to understand this a little deeper, we need to appreciate what Girard thinks being lost in deep mimetic desire is actually like. For Girard, being in extreme imitation, including extreme metaphysical desire, is paradoxically a result of self-centeredness. This is not in the sense of arrogance or of narcissism, and can even look like the exact opposite. It is rather closely related to that sense of personal inadequacy we talked about in the last section. It is an attempt to see in other people the answer to our own problems, to look to them or what they desire to let us know what will make us happy. And in small doses, this is not necessarily an issue. Social proof is not an irrational thing. But Girard thinks that at the extreme end, this distorts both our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with others. It distorts our relationship with others because we stop treating people as people in their own right, but instead as simply our mediators. But it also distorts our relationship with ourselves because our entire personhood is then just borrowed from other people. We become a patchwork of our mediators, and we lose any sight of who we are in the process. As Girard puts it, self-centeredness gives rise to imitation and makes us live outside ourselves. This self-centeredness is other-centeredness as well. Strangely, our refusal to own up to this often comes from this aspiration to extreme individual authenticity, where none of our desires are ever mediated by others. And for Girard, it is in admitting to our imitation that we can repair this strained relationship we've developed with ourselves. Once we have confessed our mimetic bent, we become aware that we have fallen short of this romantic ideal where all of our desires stem from deep within ourselves, but it also grants us the self-awareness to actually know which of our desires are purely mimetic, which genuinely do come from within, and which are a mixture of both. Girard thinks that this movement of dispelling the illusion that both maintains our ego but also maintains our misery takes an extraordinary humility but is also absolutely worth it. Or, to again quote Girard, when he renounces the deceptive divinity of pride, the hero frees himself from slavery and finally grasps the truth about his unhappiness. And it is this act of self-discovery that Girard wishes us all to partake in. It is what he thinks is behind the genius of many novelists like Flaubert, Dostoevsky, Proust, and Stendhal. For him, these authors eventually realized their own propensity towards imitation and learnt to move past it into something beyond. This development looks quite different in different characters because they all start from very different mimetic positions. Whereas Madame Bovary imitates the lifestyle of those of a higher social class, Raskolnikov has a much deeper metaphysical desire to imitate people he sees as superhuman, like Napoleon. In each case, they abandon this desire in their final moments in the novel. Sometimes far too late for it to have any positive effect, but sometimes just in time to begin a new life. It is also not just personal fulfillment on the line, but the very organisation of our societies. According to Girard, it is in recognising mimetic desires that we can resolve the conflict caused by double mediation that we mentioned earlier in the video. Once we realise that a lot of our social rivalries originate from this double mediation, they begin to lose their sting. We can subject our rivalries to questioning to see if we actually wish to continue them, but again, this requires humility. It means potentially admitting that some long-held resentments and conflicts may be to do with this slightly embarrassing human tendency. But if we can push past this, Girard thinks we can genuinely lessen the extent and impact of many of our conflicts. This cannot be achieved in one sudden realization because each new conflict will present us with all the reasons why it has nothing to do with mimesis or imitation at all. But with practice, we can learn to distinguish just when the conflict is inevitable and when it is based on double mediation. This theme of breaking cycles of violence will become much more prominent in Girard's later works, where he will discuss the way we use scapegoats and target innocent people as a vector for our collective social anger. But I plan to do a whole video on that, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on it now, but suffice to say there is much more to say about this. Lastly, I think that a fantastic revelation of this book is the simple awareness of how our seemingly spontaneous desires really are shaped by the people around us. After finishing this work, I spent a long time just sitting down and examining my own desires, and I was taken aback at how many of them did seem to have mediating origins. Girard's point is not that I must now abandon all of these desires, and I'm not even sure if such a thing is possible. But with this new piece of self-knowledge, I can better appreciate my place in the world. It dispels the notion that we are romantic-style individualists whose desires come from deep within our souls. But if Girard is right, then this new self-awareness will allow me to approach life with my eyes more open to the psychological forces at play in my own mind, and so have a more truthful relationship, both with myself and with others. And I don't know about you, but I think that is worth some serious reflection. And if you're interested in more of this psychological philosophy, then click here to watch my analysis of the origin of many of Dostoevsky's own profound insights. I hope you enjoyed this video and the change of jumper, and have a wonderful day.